Yeah. So, and everybody's here already, so we can start, right? So hi, everybody, and thank you for joining me, especially after lunch. I hope you had a good break. My name is Tamar Scheffler. I'm a product manager for Palo Alto Networks, and my focus is on Magnifier, which hopefully all of you came to hear. And what I want to talk to you about today is, first of all, present to you a real case that we had with one of our customers, and analyze this case as a case study for an advanced attack, advanced targeted attack. We'll hopefully draw some conclusions out of it. One of the conclusions, I'm telling you in advance, just a hint, will involve Magnifier, as this was a Magnifier customer, and this is a Magnifier session. And we'll also discuss how Magnifier performs behavioral analysis and helps analysts detect and investigate and eventually stop these advanced attacks, and how Magnifier covers the kill chain. We'll start with the tale from the trenches, an actual case we had with a customer. It's one of our legacy customers that was a customer before the acquisition. So unfortunately, at the time of the attack, they did not have a Palo Alto Networks firewall. They did not have traps. They are in the process of getting them. And what we saw was a very interesting scenario. It started on a Sunday, once upon a time. It started on a Sunday on a long weekend. And suddenly at 10 minutes past 2, there was a PC that was started, rebooted, and started communicating with command and control. And we'll talk about the command and control in a few minutes. We'll talk about that later. Just if you take a look at the ticker over there, you can follow the timeline of what happened. So that was on a Sunday. Post-detection, our team analyzed the case, and looking at the Windows event logs, the team concluded that the attack started with an infected USB. So there was no spear phishing, there was no remote access to it. There was actual physical access with an infected USB. Now, if we look 50 minutes later, we start seeing that PC starts doing an SMB scan on port 445 and starts probing shares to gather intelligence towards the operation, to understand what files there are, system information, domain information, directory listing, and so on. Maybe even select files and send them to the command and control. So that was only 15 minutes after the infection. And then we see quiet, nothing for 19 days. This is very typical. The attackers gathered information on the first day, and now they need time to analyze. There's an actual human being or several human beings that are going through the information, analyzing it to understand the architecture, the layout of the network, the type of files, determine the goals of the attack. And then on the 19th day, we start seeing HTTP scans over port 80 and some more share probing to gather more information. Just a few hours later, we start seeing, still on the 19th day, early in the morning, are we seeing that? Yes. Remote code execution over RPC towards the QA server. Yeah, apologies, the animation is a little bit slow. So we see remote code execution on the QA server. with local admin privileges. Now, this was probably leveraging a vulnerability. The attackers did not infect the QA server with malware. Probably they did not find it interesting, but they used it for privilege escalation. Because this is a server, they assumed there will be a privileged user connected to it. We continue with the story, and a day later, again, early morning, we see, again, remote command execution, this time, to the DC. And now it gets even more interesting because the DC is connected to all. It's accessible to all. It's a central point routing-wise. And this time they did infect the DC with malware. And it's a common attack playbook, as I don't know, 95% of companies use Active Directory, so the domain controller would be a very good starting point to an attack. So they got to the DC, they got the NTDS DIT file for the identity repository, and from that point on, just less than about an hour later, they started executing, spreading the malware to other devices in the network, to users' machines this time. So using LDAP test with domain admin privileges that they got from the domain controller. That was a very short time. To remind you, the previous one was about 5:15, something like that. So a very short time. Probably they did not actually hack the password, but used the hash of the password. And probably these devices, I'm pointing at them, I'd better do that. So probably these devices were specifically targeted. They knew what they were looking for. They selected these devices because they thought that monitoring the emails and the files of these users would be interesting for them because they're looking for the sensitive information, sensitive data, for intellectual property in this case. The story continues, and then again, we're silent. We see silence for 9 days. Again, the attackers, people, need to monitor, go over the information that was gathered and sent to the command and control, and conclude what is going to be the next step. And the next step on the 29th day is to execute remote code, again, over RPC, on the build server. Now, they thought that the intellectual property was on the build server. It was not, which they found out it took them about 2 weeks. So I don't know if it took them that long to realize that, or they took a break in between, or something else happened. But in any case, only 2 weeks after the attack on the build server, we see remote code execution on the Jenkins server, which actually held the code. So this is the intellectual property. They got to the intellectual property. That was the jackpot that they were looking for. But again, it takes time to understand, to realize that that's indeed what they were looking for. And only on the 55th day, do we see that? Yeah, on the 55th day, 12 days afterwards, they realized that the Jenkins server is indeed what holds the information that the attackers were looking for. And then they start exfiltrating the data. We're talking about many terabytes of data that were exfiltrated through the command and control channel. And basically they were done, but we have every indication that they were planning, sorry, all this story is very exciting, that they were planning to continue with the attack and continue siphoning data from that technology company that we're talking about. Now, about the command and control channel, I promised you some more information. What they did was actually use profiles created on TechNet. So any communication to TechNet, if there was monitoring on the communication, would seem completely normal from a company developing software. Someone is accessing TechNet, that's completely normal. What they did is they created sets of fake profiles and encoded commands between the dollar signs on these fake profiles. And every month, they would generate new such profiles. That's a dynamic generation algorithm, DGA. And our SecOps, Magnifier SecOps, together with GCert, were able to, they collaborated and they were able to decode the commands. So you can see over there that every month they would have different profiles. And that's the decoding of the command between the dollar signs. That was the main command and control channel. Again, it seems completely legit when you look at the logs. They had an alternative command and control channel in case this one would get blocked. The other one, the alternative, was on GitHub. Again, it seems perfectly normal. And that's the evidence that they were planning to continue with this attack for a while. So we'll go back to this story, this attack that happened in a little bit. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we can hunt down and detect these active attacks that are already taking place in the network. But first, for that, we need to look at the attack lifecycle that typically, most often starts with a vulnerability exploit and or malware installation. Not in the case that I just presented, which, as you remember, was through physical access with an infected USB. But in most cases, attacks would start with either a vulnerability exploit and or malware infection. But then the attacker, in any case, whether it's through one of these methods or through physical access, like we saw in the attack that I just presented, the attacker needs to, or attackers needs to sustain continuous connection with command and control to stay in touch with the compromised system. They need to move laterally in the environment to find the sensitive information, to get to this sensitive information, to identify where it is. As you saw, initially they didn't know exactly where it was. So they need to learn, get acquainted, do some reconnaissance, move laterally in the system, and eventually find the sensitive information and steal it, exfiltrate it outside of the organization. So if we look at these different stages, the first stages are very, very fast. They occur in seconds, and it only takes one file or one request, one action to actually complete the infection and get inside the network. And these can often be identified with indications of compromise, IOCs. However, the later stages of an attack are very, very different. First of all, they don't occur in seconds, not even in minutes. They often occur in days, weeks, and sometimes even months. Again, I remind you, we are talking the attack that I presented took 55 days between the moment of infection and the moment of data exfiltration, 55 days, and that's not the longest attack that we've seen. So it can take days, weeks, even months. It requires many operations from the attackers, hundreds, if not thousands. So think about all the port scans that they did, the share probing that they did, the lateral movement, the remote code execution, and so on. They don't know what they're dealing with, so they have to take a lot of actions in the network. And last but definitely not least, these are typically not actions that we can identify with IOCs, with indications of compromise. We're not talking about finding a specific file with a specific hash or a specific URL or IP that is being used. The attacker's action, every discrete, distinct action might look completely normal. For example, accessing TechNet seems completely normal. A user accessing the build server seems completely normal, or the DC. So it's not something that we can detect with IOC. What we can do is, first of all, to stop these attacks, we need to disrupt every stage of the attack lifecycle. Okay? And if we focus, what we do is, if we focus on the later stages, again, this is quite slow. We focus on the later stages of the attack, then, as I said, the attackers need to take hundreds, if not thousands of actions. They don't know the environment that they're in. They don't know where the jackpot, the sensitive information in. And when we're talking about malware and vulnerability exploit, the advantage is on the attacker's side because they only need to find one hole, whereas we have to cover all our bases, right? Here in the later stages, the advantage is on our side, on the protection side. Why? Because they need to perform thousands of operations, and we need to find them on one or two or just several. And we can achieve that by profiling the behavior of entities in the network, in the environment, understand what's a normal behavior for an entity, and then we can detect what's abnormal. For example, if we profile that domain controllers typically do not execute code over RPC, then we might identify such behavior as abnormal. With Magnifier, we focus on the stealthiest and most dangerous attacks, most sophisticated attacks that are already active in the network. We don't focus on the infection stage that, as I said, occurs within seconds and can probably be identified with an IOC. But we focus on these attacks that are much more difficult to detect because they're already active in your network and they seem like normal users' activities. And the 4 types that we focus on are the 4 most important types. First and foremost, targeted attacks that are performed by highly sophisticated attackers. As I shown before, the attack that took 55 days involved a lot of human interaction on the back end, on the attacker's side. They took time to analyze and learn the data. These attacks are quite destructive and very costly. So on average, $3.6 million per incident, but they can get to millions, to hundreds of millions of dollars on the larger breaches. So these are external attackers, but we can also have internal operators that collaborate or themselves are perpetrating, are responsible for an attack. 25%, a quarter of breaches are related to malicious insiders. And these are even harder to detect because these are users in the network that have privileged access and are abusing their privileges to access sensitive information and steal it and exfiltrate it. So extremely difficult to identify. But it's not just a malicious intent of a user. It can also be a well-meaning, just normal user that is acting in a risky manner. So for example, uploading sensitive information to the internet or sharing their credentials could either directly lead to an attack or open the door to such attack if, for example, they share their credentials with someone that could use them in a malicious manner. And lastly, compromised endpoints. So more than half of the breaches that were reported had compromised endpoints involved in them. And we need to focus on these compromised endpoints rather than chase every piece of email attachment that gets into the organization, because these compromised endpoints represent the exploit that succeeded. So Magnifier can help detect and stop all these types of highly risky threats. When we look at detection today, we identify several gaps or flaws in the way that we're performing, that the industry is performing detection. First of all, we don't have the right data. Organizations typically try to detect malicious activity by looking at logs from security solutions that alert on known malicious things, files, traffic, and so on. So we're only looking at the bad stuff, and we're neglecting the good stuff. We're not collecting logs for the normal, everyday, benign behavior. But if we want to profile and we want to identify anomalous behavior, then just looking at the bad stuff is not enough. And even if organizations were to look at the good stuff, at the good logs, at the benign logs, then we start talking about completely different scale of data that organizations today are not equipped to cope with. This is a totally different scale of cost as well, and it's more often than not, it is cost prohibitive to collect the benign logs as well as the malicious ones. And on top of collecting the logs, it's not enough to collect the logs, but what we see is that analysts define static rules. So the problem with static rules is A, that you have to develop them, B, that you have to maintain them, and C, what's, in my opinion, the most problematic is that we're solving yesterday's problem. We're blocking yesterday's attack. So defining a static rule to say, oh yeah, I have seen that risky behavior, so I will not allow it anymore. I will write a rule to not allow that behavior, is like closing the stable doors after the horses ran, or as I was told that in Dutch, I'm supposed to say, covering the well after the cow fell in. So yes, we are covering the well, and the next cow will not fall in, but what about the other wells? So again, static rules are probably are important, but we're protecting against yesterday's attack, we're protecting against the known attacks. And finally, the slow investigation. It takes weeks to understand whether a specific event is malicious or not. Analysts need to go to the endpoint and manually investigate it, collect information. And again, this is something that if an attack is active, if an attack is in your network, you would want to stop it right there and then, as soon as you know. And for that, what we can do is, first and foremost, look at the right data. For effective detection, we need to look at comprehensive network, endpoint, cloud data, rich data that preferably is collected by existing infrastructure. We don't want to start deploying more and more hardware to collect this information. To store all this information, as I said, we're talking about massive amounts of data. This is, I'm trying not to say big data, but it's difficult not to. This is huge data. So we need to be at scale. And the way to achieve that is through cloud. That also means that you don't need to deploy hardware. And that also provides agility, as the vendor can frequently update the software and release new logic, new algorithms, new detections. Instead of static rules that are preventing cows from falling into yesterday's well, we need to employ a more, I don't want to say, clever. We need to find a more clever way to detect these attacks. And the way to do that is through machine learning, by profiling what consists a normal behavior, a legitimate behavior. We can identify what is out of the norm, what is an abnormal behavior, and we can detect this suspicious and often malicious activity. And eventually, what we want to achieve is rapid response. Detect quickly and respond as fast as possible. So get the information to have a small number of alerts, to have actionable alerts with information that is relevant to the investigation, with a way to gather more information from the endpoints automatically, and then to respond as fast as possible through the firewall on the endpoint itself. Obviously, this is what we do with Magnifier. Magnifier Behavioral Analytics empowers organizations to quickly find and stop the most advanced and risky alerts. We analyze rich network, endpoint, and cloud data. And through that, with machine learning, we can accurately and quickly detect targeted attacks. Malicious insiders, risky behavior, and compromised endpoints, all the types of threats that we discussed earlier. With automatic interrogation of the endpoint, security analysts can make their investigation quicker and respond quickly. Respond quickly through actions on the firewall itself. How we do it, I'll have to take a sip for that, because that's going to be a lot. First, we collect network, endpoint, and cloud logs. They go to the logging service. Magnifier is the first application that was built on top of the application framework. We actually worked with the application framework team to make sure that it can sustain our needs. So logs are collected, rich data with user ID, app ID, content ID, and is then analyzed in Magnifier. We profile entities, we profile their behavior, and based on that, we can detect what consists normal activity and what consists abnormal and hence suspicious and maybe malicious activity. Once we detect a suspicious entity, we have a component that is called Pathfinder VM. That's a virtual machine that resides in the network. And automatically, as soon as suspicious behavior is detected, Pathfinder automatically interrogates the endpoint and interrogates the endpoint and brings back information that is relevant to the investigation of the threat. So that supports the quick investigation, supports the actionability of the alert, the ability to take action on an alert, and eventually help the analyst to take action to respond to the threat by blocking the, what happened to the animation? Yeah. To block the endpoint on the firewall, or to block a malicious destination. Okay. How we detect these threats? So we talked about targeted attacks, malicious insider, risky behavior, and compromised endpoints. We map different typical behaviors that typically appear in such threats, in such attacks. We do that by analyzing, as I said, the rich data with app ID, user ID, traffic logs, but also threat logs, and also enhanced application logs like DHCP logs, DNS, and so on. We use both supervised and unsupervised machine learning. So for example, profiling an entity or deciding what type an entity is done with supervised machine learning. To remind you, supervised machine learning is when we can train the system and tell her, this is a glass, these are glasses, and these are bottles. These are iPhones, these are database servers, and then we can, we learn, the system learns, and then can identify and assign the type to devices by the traffic it sees. So the system can say, this is a workstation, this is an iPhone, that one is a mail server or an Oracle DB. That's supervised machine learning. However, when we arrive to detecting attacks, it is more difficult to achieve supervised machine learning, as there are only a limited number of examples that we can give the system with labels on them to say, okay, this is a malicious insider, and this is a targeted attack. In this case, we employ unsupervised machine learning. So we observe the behavior. The system learns what is a normal behavior when it comes, for example, to remote command execution. What consists legitimate, normal RCE, and what might be abnormal RCE. Or if we talk about new administrative behavior, what is a legitimate administrative behavior, for example, by an IT user or from an IT device, and what constitutes an abnormal administrative activity on which we will alert. So that's how we do behavioral analytics, and then the alerts that we provide are enriched with user information from both user ID and directory sync services. It is enriched by endpoint and processes data from Pathfinder, as I said, that automatically goes and interrogates the endpoint and brings back information about the executables that are running on that machine, the open ports, different suspicious files that were found on that machine, and that helps the investigation process and expedite it. And ultimately, what we want is to be able to respond. So on the firewall, we can block that a suspicious source. And from Magnifier, we can define EDL, the external dynamic lists, to block malicious destinations. Now, if I go back now to our attack, as you remember, that was PC on a Sunday in a long weekend that through an infected USB started communicating with command and control. Took them 55 days to do all sorts of actions, remote code execution, port scanning, share probing, and so on, to get to the source. Where is it? To the source code and exfiltrated terabytes of data to fake profiles on TechNet. Now, what happened there? First of all, they did have not Magnifier, but the equivalent legacy product that we have before the acquisition, but very similar. They did have that. So what happened there? First of all, they did not have Palo Alto Networks firewalls and traps. That's the one thing. So defense in layers. It's not just behavioral analytics, but we also need network security, endpoint security in place. Second of all, yes, they did have the product, and just to show you, this is how PC1, that infected PC, looked like. It was lit up like a Christmas tree. It's typically not the case, right? Typically, we would catch that after 1, 2, 5 alerts. We don't need a dozen. Magnifier, for example, provides, it's not very noisy. On average, we produce 1 alert per 1,000 devices a day. Okay, so this is really not, this is an abnormal situation. And the reason is that, yes, they did have the legacy behavioral analytics solution. Problem is, no one was looking. So lesson 1 is defense in depth or in layers. Lesson 2, there are not that many alerts. 1 alert per 1,000 devices. Someone should be looking at these alerts. Otherwise, you know, if an alert fires in the dark and nobody looks at it, does it make a sound? Yes, it does. It made a sound in our backend, so our SecOps in standard review picked that up and informed the customer and worked with them to investigate, and with GCERT as well. So that's the second lesson. The third lesson that I want to leave you with, well, I'm not leaving just yet, but just to, hopefully it will stay with you, is that, and I believe it was said several times already this week, is that we cannot control what we do not see. Now, it's great. We do have customers that start with a firewall on the perimeter. And they say, we just want to protect ourselves from intruders and exfiltrations. So we will just put a firewall on the perimeter. In that case, if I go back to the attack, yeah, we would have caught the command and control, which is interesting by itself, but this is just one indication of malicious activity. I would say this is just the tip of the iceberg, or I'm just looking at it with one eye, right? If we don't have the visibility to internal data flows, if we don't have segmentation and we don't see the logs of traffic going inside the data center, then we wouldn't have been able to identify the remote code executions, the port scanning, the probing, and so on. So many of all the lateral movement, the reconnaissance, we would not be able to see that, right? So the 3 things that I hope I'm able to deliver is defense in depth, look at the alerts, and segmentation, or full visibility into network traffic. I do want to go over we do have time, yeah, we're good. Over the attack lifecycle, if you remember, I showed that before. Most attacks start with vulnerability and or malware installation, but all of them will need to sustain command and control connectivity, do lateral movement to explore, to find more information in the environment, and eventually get to sensitive data, steal it, exfiltrate it outside the organization. How can Magnifier help you detect these different steps in the attack lifecycle? Now, honestly, on vulnerability exploit, we have our brothers in traps, and that's what they do. That's what they're experts in, and also malware installation. This is the job of the endpoint protection. We do have some detection of, oh, that was too quickly, of malware installation. So when we do interrogations of an endpoint, we bring back files that seem suspicious. What are files that seem suspicious? For example, files that are not, that do not widely exist in the environment. Since we have the visibility, Magnifier has the visibility of the entire deployment. If we see files that are rare, that do not exist widely in the deployment, then we will bring them back, send them to WildFire, and report on the result. So there are a couple of examples. But as I said, our focus is more on the later stages where attackers need to take a lot of steps, a lot of actions, and each step by itself might look normal, might look like a legitimate user is performing this action. But if we look at it as a whole, that jumped too quickly. If we look at it as a whole, then we can identify that this is abnormal activity. So for example, in command and control, we have different detectors. For example, this one is a tunneling process. What we have, and we have the explanation up here, we have a process that is listening on a port internally and also opening connections to the outside world, to the internet. So this is something that is typically used in command and control to evade other security solutions. So that's something that consists suspicious behavior. Other detectors that we have is recurring rare domains. So for example, if someone is accessing that domain that we may not have any reputation information on, how do we know if that's a malicious domain or a benign domain? If we have just the one user connecting with it, if it's a rare domain, and I think you can see here, accessed by this host only during the past 14 days. So that's the machine learning part. The system learned that no one is accessing this site. This is the first user, this is the first device to access this destination. This raises some flag, okay? This is something that is worth investigating, especially if it coincides with other alerts as well. Actually, before I get into the failed DNS, one of my favorite detections that is not here, that I did not put here, my bad, is random looking domains, okay? So the system picks up on domains that are randomly generated just by looking at the domain name. But consider that what's gibberish to me, my first language is Hebrew. So if I see something in Chinese, it would probably look all garbled and gibberishy. But if you look at a domain that is totally legitimate for me, it will look gibberishy and garbled to you. And actually, the system, through machine learning, knows to identify what constitutes a random-looking domain that is completely gibberish and what is an actual string in whatever language it will be, just based on what users are commonly accessing. Failed DNS is the one that I skipped. This is typically indicative, I forgot the word, because I was thinking in Hebrew. This is typically indicative of a dynamic generation algorithm. Failed DNS means that the attacker or the malicious process is trying to access random domains or dynamically generated domains, and they're not accessible, and hence the failed DNS resolution. So again, typically we have here the baseline from machine learning. Typically, a device would access 0.04, will try to resolve 0.04, and it will fail. But we have this device that had 80 failed resolutions. So again, this raises a red flag. I do want to keep some time for questions. In Magnifier, and you can still see a demo at the expo booth, from the alert itself and also from the entities on which we alert, you can drill down into the logs that are basically the evidence to the alerts that we generated. So for this failed DNS, you can see all the failed requests with their response, all the different domains that this device tried to access. Just one more I will do on lateral movement, and that one is a port scan. So again, we have the baseline, which is the machine learned that typically in our environment, a device accesses a destination on 13 ports on average. And in this case, it was 352, so considerably larger than normal. And again, it merits an alert. We have, I think, 5 minutes. Yeah, is that correct? So are there any questions, or do you want me to show another alert? Show of hands. Yes? What happens to the bad guys? Oh, there, yeah, I cannot elaborate on that. So, you know, what's the difference between a good question and an excellent question? A good question is one that I don't have an answer to, and an excellent question is the one that I do. So thank you for that. This is a work in progress, so this is completely non-committed, but this is part of the XDR vision. This is actually the XDR vision for us. We are working very closely with the Traps team. They are working on integrating the SecDo capabilities of continuously logging endpoint activity. These logs will be written to the logging service, from which Magnifier will ingest these endpoint logs, and then we will be able to not only correlate the endpoint information, just like we do with Pathfinder, we will be able to correlate with network alerts, but we will also be able to generate endpoint-based alerts. So detect, right now we focus on detecting anomalous behavior based on network activity, and we will add the ability to detect also based on endpoint activity. So thank you for that. Yes? So different detectors have different false positive rate. Again, I cannot give you an exact number, but since we generate 1 alert per 1,000 devices, the noise level is quite low. And with every customer and with every POC that we've done, there were real malicious activity or risky activity detected by Magnifier. Yes? No. So again, the question was whether we can have, I should repeat the question, whether we can do on-prem versus cloud. No, we are completely cloud. If there are concerns, then we can address these concerns together with our colleagues in the logging service. The data in the logging service is stored on Palo Alto Networks data centers that are located in the US and in the EU. So we have 2 data centers. We have security certifications for the data centers, SOC 2 Type 2. And again, we can continue this discussion if you'd like. Oh, I have a microphone. I'm so, you know, with all the excitement talking about the attacks and wow.
Assuming that I have 10,000 clients, how you get uploaded all of this traffic through your logging service? You need it from the endpoint, you need it from the switches, routers, everything.
Oh, okay. So first of all, thank you for your question, because I need to explain the architecture. We're collecting logs from the firewall. 10,000, a deployment of 10,000 workstations is something that we already do and support. It depends on the log rate, but this is something that is well within the capacity today. So that's definitely something that is doable. We have customers doing that, so that's not really an issue. Uploading the firewall logs, this is something that is done. As for the endpoint, this is still work in progress. So really, there's not much I can add on that, except to say that it has to be feasible for it to be done. So definitely, 10,000 is definitely within the realm of capacity for Magnifier. For traps logs, this is still work in progress, and I do believe that it's within their goal. So, but if we're talking about today, network, then definitely you can be in touch with one of our partners or your local SE and get a POC and see how it works. I think that's the best way to evaluate and to understand both the value. I was asked about the false positive rate, and both the value and the performance. Yes?
Assuming that the magnifier detected one user exhibits abnormal, a strange behavior, does it inform the firewall to block it or not? If yes, is it done based on IP or user?
So right now it's not automatic. It's not that Magnifier informs. Blocking the suspicious source, the suspicious device, needs to be done in the firewall itself. It's not done automatically. What we can do is add a suspicious destination to the EDL on the firewall, and then the blocking is automatic. Again, you need to, the analyst, a human being needs to analyze the alert and determine whether it's a real threat, and then just add it to the EDL, and it's blocked on the firewall. Okay. We've even passed the time, but I'll be here all week. No, I'm joking. I will be here in the expo hall if you have any more questions. My colleagues are there to show you a demo if you wish to. And of course, as I said, please, I urge you to contact partners and the local SE and arrange a POC and see how it works for you. Thank you all. Have a great day.